Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, and I have the pleasure of conversing today with Dr. Samuel Gregg of the Acton Institute, who is a wonderful author and commentator on issues relating to Christianity, economics, and culture, among other topics. And we're mostly going to focus today on his very latest book, which I'm going to let him hold up to show you and describe to you.
The title is Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization. It came out in June last year. If you want a copy, the best way to get it is to go straight to Amazon.com.
Excellent. And this is your 7th or 8th book, isn't it, Sam?
Number 12, I believe.
Number 12. And I'm sure you've got dozens more in your head. That will be
that too.
Coming years.
Dozens of books in our head.
Well, your book obviously is sweeping in its scope, but outline its basic themes for us, if you could, please.
Well, like many people, I have thought a lot about this relationship between reason and faith, because, of course, it's a question that never goes away, be it for believers or non-believers. But I argue in the book that if you want to understand why Western civilization has taken on the particular form that it has, why it has assumed certain contours, why it has been particularly successful in particular areas, but also if you want to understand some of its problems, you need to understand the particular relationship between the world of reason and the world of faith that was forged in the West, beginning with the Hebrew people, with the Jews, then with the Greeks, and then of course Christianity takes this particular synthesis of the roles and nature of religion and reason and really synthesizes them in a way that I think if it didn't exist, the West, in my view, would not be the West. It would certainly be something almost unrecognizable to us today. And
so because of this unique hybrid of Hebraic thought, Christianity, Greek and Roman thought, the West has a particular view of history and where we're headed. Is that basically your theme?
That's part of the argument, yes, because as you know, in the pagan world, history and time was seen in very circular ways. There wasn't a sense of one was going from A to Z, or as the scriptures say, from Alpha to the Omega. Time was seen as very circular. Life was seen as largely meaningless by most people, including by most Greek philosophers. There are obviously exceptions like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, but they're very much a minority in the pagan world. But the other thing I think which is very important is this idea of logos. Logos is the Greek word for the word. And as you know, if you read the Gospel of John in the original Greek, it begins by saying, in the beginning was the Logos. And it's very deliberate. It's very deliberate because the author of the Gospel of John is trying to present a particular conception of the nature of God. Now, if we read the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, we know that God is truth. We know that God is love. But what comes out, really partly because of this encounter between the Jewish and Greek world, but also I think, and I argue, the particular way in which the Hebrew people understood the nature of Yahweh, is that God is divine love, he's truth, he's the creator, but he's also divine reason itself. And we as human beings, made in the image of God, we share in that likeness to the extent that we possess reason and will. Now, obviously, we are marked by sin. Obviously, we make mistakes. Obviously, we make errors. We choose wrongly a lot of the time. But none of that means that somehow we're fundamentally irrational. And none of that means that we can't use our reason when we're thinking about questions to do with faith, to do with creation, to do with science, or to do with questions of history, as you mentioned right at the beginning. So these are some of the things I try to tease out in the book. And I basically argue that if you want to understand the ups and downs of Western history, so to speak, this relationship between faith and reason and this critical understanding of the nature of God as logos is absolutely critical, because when we lose a sense of God as having this attribute of divine reason, then we end up in some pretty unpleasant places, I think. So one of the things the book tries to do is explain how so many of the problems, particularly problems of the 20th century, can be understood as pathologies of faith and pathologies of reason. By pathology, I mean a type of sickness. And this is what happens, I think, both to faith and to reason when they get separated from each other. So a very obvious example of a pathology of faith would be something like jihadism, right? Because in jihadist conceptions of Islam, there's no place for reason, either on the part of God or on the part of human beings. Reason is not important. What matters is what God tells you, and that's the end of the discussion. So God can tell you to do terribly unreasonable things, but you just have to do it. You can't reason with this God and say, hey, that's not such a good idea, or even ask the question, why would a good God ask me to do something so bad? A flip side to that would be something like a pathology of reason. A pathology of reason, an example of that would be scientism. Scientism, the notion that we can only know truth through the natural sciences. Now, I say in the book that the natural sciences emerge in a Christian world, and that's not a mistake. It's not a coincidence that it really first acquires traction in the medieval period and then continues to gather a pace after that. So Christianity has never had a problem with science per se. It's never had an issue with science, ever. There's no evidence of this at all, that somehow Christians are anti-science. That's simply nonsensical. But we do know that when we reduce reason to the natural sciences, to the empirical method, for example, then we really narrow the horizons of what our minds are capable of understanding. So, for example, we can do things like use physics or nuclear physics to develop nuclear power, nuclear weapons, etc. But a scientist, qua scientist, or an empirical reason, qua empirical reason, can't tell us what's a good use or a bad use of nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. It's not capable of doing that. Even the whole scientific enterprise is premised on the principle that it's good to know truth, that this is a good thing for us. Science can't tell you that in itself. You need other forms of knowledge to give us that type of information, and that comes through things like philosophy or things like theology. So when I go through the book, I try and basically unpack as much of this history as possible. And in the end, I try to say, look, if we want to get back to the best of Western civilization, if we really want to understand how faith and reason can be better integrated, then I think we have to recover this notion of the idea of God as logos. Because when you lose a sense of God of logos, then faith and reason start to fall apart in the sense that they start to move away from each other. But if you can rehabilitate this notion of God as logos, then I think reason and faith can come back into a much better alignment with one another. And until we do that, I think we'll continue to struggle with problems like scientism, like jihadism. I would even argue that something like what some people call liberal religion is really another pathology of both, not just of reason, but of faith as well, because it certainly doesn't take God as logos very seriously at all.
Is it fair to say that Western civilization, because of its unique roots, has a unique concept of human agency, whereas other cultures are more fatalistic or deterministic?
Well, yes and no, because on the one hand, you can find fatalistic elements in certain strands of Western culture, right? I mean, there's a fairly strong dimension of fatalism, and I talk about this in the book, in the ancient Greek world. The Greeks and the Romans to a certain extent as well. So these are the pagan Roman world, the pagan Greek world, many of the pagan religions of the Near East. They certainly had deeply dark visions of the world and not much respect for human agency. Now, as I said, there are Greeks like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, who clearly do have a sense of agency. They do think that people can make choices, that we are actors. But it is interesting, I think, that it's only with the advent of Christianity that fatalism, I think, starts to disappear from the mental horizon of lots and lots of what we would call different facets of European culture. And it's really Christianity, I think, that makes that decisive breakthrough. Of course, the Jews had already done it. If you go back and you read the Hebrew scriptures where it talks about, I set before you life or death, blessing or curse, choose life so that you may live. It's very clear that the Hebrew scriptures are saying it's not just that God is a creator and active in history. Humans are active. Humans can make choice for good and for evil. And Christianity takes that insight into truth, that truth about the human person, and really spreads it throughout the Mediterranean world and immerses that idea into Western culture. And I don't think it's a mistake that when you see a weakening of Christianity in any culture, actually, that you start to see confidence in people's agency starting to disappear. So as you know, we have people, we have now entire fields of study who purport that there is no such thing as people being able to make choices, that we're all just driven by electrodes in our brains and driven by our DNA and our impulses. And of course, 10 seconds reflection makes it very clear that that's nonsense, because presumably you and I talking here, if it was true that this was just simply synapses in our brains firing, then we wouldn't be able to understand each other, we wouldn't be able to follow each other's train of thought or anything like that. And yet we do it all the time. We wouldn't even be able to change the topic of conversation and consciously do it. So I don't think it's a mistake that when Christianity starts to fade, and by Christianity I really mean small o Orthodox Christianity, when that starts to fade from a culture, we shouldn't be surprised that we see large numbers of often very educated people denying that human beings can really make any choices at all.
And I suppose by definition, liberal or heterodox Christianity is always trying to minimize the logos, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Starting with Arius, I suppose.
Well, it's not a new, like all heresies, there's no such thing as a new heresy, right? They're all some version of something that happened in the first 4 centuries of Christianity. But one of the things with, let's call it liberal Christianity or liberal religion, is you're absolutely right. It really denies the idea of God as logos. It really reduces God and reduces Christ to what I call a celestial teddy bear. So this is a God who loves us, but never tells us that perhaps some things are not good for us, or never tells us that such a certain choice is always wrong and another choice is always right, who never tells us that we are indeed responsible for our actions, our choices, and that we've been given freedom and we're supposed to use it in particular ways, not just any way. Liberal Christianity really more or less denies all that. And I think it's partly because it denies the idea of God as logos. And once you do that, then things like the scriptures, for example, they're no longer the account of different people who witnessed the life of Christ, really witnessed the life of Christ. Suddenly, it becomes just stories, nice stories. that are meant to inspire us. The dead giveaway, I think, is whenever, I'm sure you've experienced this as well, Mark, when I'm at church and I hear, in my case, a priest say something like, I feel that. And I just stop thinking at that point because I realize, look, no, we're not here to engage in an exchange of feelings. You're here to explicate the truth of the scriptures to us. And to do that, you have to engage your mind. Now, that doesn't mean that feelings or passions have no role to play. They obviously do have a role to play. They prevent us from becoming robots, of sort of logical robots, if you like. But when we push that dimension of reason out, we're left with God as an understanding of God that is not faithful to the true Christian understanding of what love is. Because love, as you know, in Christianity is intimately wrapped up with truth. These two things can't be separated in small o Orthodox Christianity. And I see in liberal Christianity, basically capital T truth gets thrown out the door, which means that whatever coherence that there is comes from the adoption of secular ideologies, which is one of the reasons I think you find in my world, the Roman Catholic world, and in much of, for example, the Protestant world, why you see ideological agendas take over so much of the rhetoric and language and concerns of many believers, because they've thrown the capital T truth out the door. God is not logos anymore, but we all long for order. We all long to see how things fit together. And so they revert to secular ideologies to try and provide a comprehensive understanding of the world that Jesus is my teddy bear simply cannot give us.
And in terms of the political implications of your theme, obviously flowing from the Logos is the idea that we're all image bearers of God. And with that concept, each of us has a certain dignity. And from that concept of dignity, there are rights and duties that society and states must respect. Absolutely.
And it's curious, isn't it, that in the pagan world, be it the pagan world of the Near East or the pagan world of Greeks and Rome, all those things you just mentioned really didn't have much purchase, if at all. Because in that world, humans are not the image of God. They are, at best, beings that are floating through a circular vision of time who are being manipulated by the gods and goddesses. If you read the Greek and Roman myths, it's all about human beings being manipulated, tricked, humiliated, etc. All those things reflect the type of religious standpoint that was very influential, obviously, in the pagan world. And Christianity comes along, and suddenly women are in equal in dignity to men. Suddenly, children are not virtual property. Suddenly, they are sons and daughters of God. Suddenly, slaves are no longer subhumans. So now suddenly, if you're a Roman or a Greek and you become a Christian, it's very clear that you have to change the way you think about these people who you own. So Christianity represents a radically different vision of the person, which, as you say, is very much bound up in this image-bearing capacity that we alone have. And as part of that capacity, we also reflect both God's social nature in the sense of the Trinity, but we also reflect God's nature as divine logos, which means Christianity has always taken reason very seriously. I mean, it's often the case, as you know, that Christians are often portrayed as, well, you're just all about blind faith, you're all about feelings, you don't think about things. Well, actually, I think Christianity thinks very seriously about reason, and actually, in many respects, has a higher regard for reason in that full sense of the word than virtually all secular ideologies.
And in terms of economics, there would be, I presume, a line from the concept of logos to concepts of creativity, entrepreneurship,
Right.
lawful societies that protect property?
Absolutely, because again, as you know, in the pagan world, economic creativity wasn't particularly valued. Remember, if you're a Roman citizen or a Greek citizen, the highest things and callings in life were war and politics. But Judaism, as we know, took work very, very seriously. This is one of the things that distinguished Jewish people in the ancient world, is that they really did view work as something that was good and to be done. When Christianity universalizes that sense that we have a responsibility for the world, that we're meant to transform the world, that we're meant to be creative with our minds and our hearts and our hands, etc., that creates a very different way of thinking about the economy, because you move away from, again, a sort of circular vision of the world, a rather static vision of the world, towards a vision of the world that has purpose, that we can be creative in shaping, and which is future directed. So the Michael Novak, who I know you knew very well, he used to talk about this all the time, and he would say that the idea of human beings as being made in the image of God implies that they, like God, are co-creators. And you can't have a dynamic economy unless people can engage in creative forms of work. You can't have entrepreneurship. You can't really have free enterprise. You don't value those things anymore without this sense that there's something intrinsic to human beings that makes them want to transform things around them for the better. And I think the best way we have of explaining where this comes from, I think, is the Christian account of the nature of the world and the God who made it.
In terms of culture, I have an artist friend who makes the point that Christianity, through the incarnation, was a tremendous validation of the presentation of the human body in art. I assume there are countless ways that the Logos has influenced Western culture, but how would you articulate it?
Well, I certainly think that if you look at the high points of Christian art, and so we're really talking about, in that respect, people like Michelangelo, or we can move into Reformation Europe and some of the wonderful art that was produced in places like Germany and England, etc. I mean, it's interesting because first of all, there's an appreciation of the human body, of human physicality. There's a lot of detailed attention to this. But there's also the sense that this is good. It's good to be able to express these sorts of things. And that part of the purpose of art is to show this order that exists in human beings, in the world that they have created, and also to try and explain why it is that sometimes that order breaks down, whether it's through things like sickness or human beings doing terrible things to each other. And again, I think if you go back to this idea of logos, and if you take the view that people at this period of time really did believe that God had this particular nature, I think it explains why something like Renaissance Florence looks very different from a neo-Stalinist brutalist architecture of the mid-20th century. It really does help to explain why cathedrals, beautiful cathedrals built at different points of history, are so much more attractive than 1960s concrete brutalism.
I'm sure you've read or you're familiar with Tom Holland's new book, Dominion, which essentially he's making the case almost the whole world has benefited from Christendom or from the Logos, just because the principles have been in many ways universalized. How do you feel about his concept? Well, what do you think about his concept?
Yes, what do I think? Well, I mean, and it's interesting. The interesting thing about Tom Holland is that he's not a believer. Mm-hmm. He's not a believer. And he nonetheless looks at history and basically says, well, if it wasn't for Christianity, all these things that many quite secular-minded people today take for granted would have struggled to see the light of day. I think it was actually Lord Acton who put it very well. You probably remember that Lord Acton wrote A History of Liberty in Antiquity and a History of Liberty in Christianity. And what he basically said was, the Greek and Roman world could get to a certain point when it came to things like law, politics, or the way we thought about constitutional order, etc. But there was something missing that the pagan world could not generate on its own. And one of the things that was missing was that the pagan world basically divinized nature. So you had gods of water, Neptune, you had gods of lightning, gods for this, gods for that. And Judaism and then Christianity comes along and basically de-divinizes the natural world. And that's a type of liberation. And Lord Acton's point was that you needed the intervention of this particular type of religion to move societies in such a way that they overcame this type of mental barrier that they had to understanding things like, well, what does a good political order look like? How do we build freedom and justice into the ways that our institutions work? The Greeks and Romans went a long way in that regard. There's no question about that. But people like Tom Holland, and I guess myself, have been arguing that without Christianity, it's hard to see how they could have progressed much further than what they had got to at the time of the beginning of Christianity. Very, very hard to see, for example, how they could have arrived at the conclusion themselves that slavery, for example, was wrong. Now, it took, as you know, almost 2,000 years for a highly Christianized West to get rid of the institution of slavery. But I think it was Alexis de Tocqueville who said that with the advent of Christianity, slavery as an institution became decisively delegitimized. And it was only a matter of time before the full realization of what that meant and what it required would happen. So as I said, it didn't happen immediately. It took a very long time. But I don't think it's a mistake that the strongest campaigners for something like the abolition of slavery were not Enlightenment thinkers. Most Enlightenment thinkers, secular Enlightenment thinkers, weren't particularly exercised by the problem of slavery. They just weren't. But it was really people, Christians in the late 18th century, people like Wilberforce, for example, and it was their faith. It was really their faith and the realization that we have to take seriously this equality of all men in the sight of God, and that no human being can possibly be the property of another person. That realization that took them down the path of working to overturn slavery, but it would never have happened, I would argue, without the advent of Christianity.
Fascinating and inspiring. If you could hold your book up one more time.
No problem. Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization.
Excellent. Dr. Samuel Gregg, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark. Great to talk with you.